Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today we're going to jump into some of those strategies for analysis that I mentioned last week. Maybe some of these are already familiar to you. Maybe you've used some of these strategies in previous classes, but I would like to spend the next few weeks really working with these strategies. I want us to all practice, get more comfortable with these approaches. These are really just ways to generate original analysis. And that's what we want. These are strategies that will sort of help you to zero in on specific elements in these literary works that you are interested in, things that you want to talk about, things that you want to explore further. But also these strategies will just allow you to be a better observer. You'll be able to identify important elements, important developments, important features in these texts, and then you'll be able to do things with those observations. You'll be able to turn those observations, hopefully, into original claims, and then you can start to develop some of your own ideas. You can start to put forward your own theories about some of the things that you're finding and considering. So these strategies really give you a lot of options. I want to be clear that, these strategies aren't designed to take you to a particular interpretation. That's really up to you. These are just ways to generate original content, and where you end up, the ideas that you advance, the interpretation you ultimately arrive at, that's totally up to you. That's always up to the individual reader and analyzer. So this week we're going to talk about 3 specific strategies. Surface and depth is number 1, and then we're talking about patterns, and then we're talking about opposites. So these are 3 pretty basic strategies. Again, they might be familiar to you already, but we're going to cover those this week, and then we'll move on to some new strategies next week. And what I would like to do as we are practicing, or as we are sort of rehearsing some of these concepts, I would like us to apply them to a specific literary work. And this is how we're often going to use the readings that I assign throughout the semester. We're really going to use them as ways to practice the concepts or strategies that we're talking about in class. So by now, you guys should have completed the week 1 reading, which was a short story entitled The Thing Around Your Neck, written by Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian-American writer. You might be familiar with her. She's pretty famous, at least as famous as a literary writer can be these days. She's pretty well known within literary circles. She writes novels and short stories, and maybe even some essays, some nonfiction stuff as well. The story that we read was the title story from a 2009 collection of short stories published by Adichie, which the entire collection is just called The Thing Around Your Neck. So this is the title story. We're not reading the entire collection, but this does give us a good sort of introduction to her style and a lot of the themes that she explores in her fiction. So we can use this story as a way to practice surface depth, and then patterns, and then opposites. So we can identify some of these things working in the short story, and I'll try to model for you guys how we could maybe utilize these strategies if we were going to write an analysis of this particular short story. So this is how we will often do things. So next week, in the week 3 lecture, we'll be using some of the poems that we're reading in week 2 to help us practice the strategies that we're discussing next week. So I'll always be talking about, in these lectures, I'll always be sort of referencing the reading that you did the previous week. So by the time you're watching the lecture, you've already completed the reading that I'm talking about. So let's start with surface to depth, because this is one of the most basic strategies that we can use when we're conducting literary analysis. It's pretty easy to understand, and it kind of mirrors the larger journey that we are on as we read literature and then start analyzing literature. So let's start by talking a little bit about the surface. We all understand what sort of a surface reading is. So when we talk about surface to depth, we're really talking about the difference between the two. But we have to start with the surface. So this is almost like a literal reading of the text. And we always start here. Again, we don't end here. It's important to realize that we do have to ultimately go beyond the surface, beneath the surface, in order to grapple with deeper meanings. So if you want to get a definition down for this first strategy, I would just use this. I would say this. With surface to depth, we start on the surface, we understand the surface first. And then we go beneath the surface, we go deeper in order to reveal less obvious meanings that are beneath the surface. And we can kind of think of this both literally and figuratively. So we're going for more complex, in some cases more hidden meanings. We're going beyond the obvious, beyond those surface level appearances. That's really what surface to depth is all about. But before we can go beneath the surface, like I was saying, we have to make sure that we understand the surface. So that's always step one. As a reader, you have to make sure that you understand the work of literature that you are reading. And I know that sounds painfully obvious, but it is worth repeating. It is worth remembering. Because again, this is a process. This is a multi-step process. So we're beginning with square one, step one. Read the text and understand the text. Understand what happens. Understand the plot. Understand who the characters are. You might not understand all of the characters' motivations. You might not always understand why characters are doing certain things, because it's often hard to understand the things that other people do. But understand the actions that they take, at least, just the literal, meaning of what's happening. What are they doing? What are the major narrative events? Right? So what is the plot? What are the major events of the plot? And also just sort of apprehend the basics. What is the overall meaning of the obvious major events that we witness in the text? So this is, a surface level understanding is sometimes sort of thought of in a negative light. And again, it can be a bad thing if you never go beyond the surface, if you stay on the surface level and you never get to anything deeper. Yeah, that's a problem. But at the beginning of this process, the surface is good. You have to know the surface. You have to be comfortable with the surface before we can go any further. So let me show you an example. Let's go to the thing around your neck. It might be a good idea to have that text open so you can refer to it during lecture. But let's just think about the surface level of this story. Basically just what happens, okay, what's going on, and what are some of the most obvious meanings that we can grasp. So we're not only thinking about plot and characters here, we're also just thinking about some of the most obvious thematic material, like some of the most obvious messages or meanings that are coming across from this sort of literal surface level reading. So let me give you an example of kind of where we would start on the surface with this particular story. Again, we would really just sort of want to start with a little bit of plot summary. We need to make sure that we understand the plot. We understand what is literally happening in the story. So we could start with you or the narrator, and we definitely have to talk about point of view in this story because that's a very important element at work. But we start with the narrator, Akuna. We do learn her name eventually, although it's almost never used in the text, but she does mention it when she's talking about sort of meeting, or being courted by her future boyfriend. So the narrator immigrates to the U.S. from Nigeria. We know that. And there may be a little bit of a biographical element here, and we can think about that in the future since we do know that Adichie herself is from Nigeria. She spent time in the U.S. I think she went to school here, at least at some point, for some of her higher education. So we could always pursue that later. But we know that our narrator is coming to the U.S. from Nigeria. And she's, college age, I would say. She's still very much a young person, but not like a little kid. Okay, so initially she moves in with her uncle. So she's been able to come over due to the American visa lottery. And she just, I think, lucks out and happens to be the name that gets drawn. So she comes over to live with her uncle, who resides in Maine, what is described as a small white town in Maine. He obviously has a pretty good job. He's already come over and sort of adapted or assimilated to the U.S., and she comes to live with him. And he enrolls her in the local community college, and it seems like she's got a pretty good path toward citizenship and maybe having a quality life here in America. Though we do learn that she encounters racism, cultural ignorance. She kind of learns to deal with it. Her uncle tells her, yeah, a lot of Americans don't know very much about Africans. They're going to ask us sort of silly questions. They're going to make, in some cases, some very stereotypical, offensive assumptions. Just sort of deal with it. That's just part of the whole process of adapting to life here. So, okay, we learned that, but we also learned that she more or less feels at home in her uncle's house. They speak Igbo, her native language. She's sort of embraced and welcomed by her uncle's wife and their children. So she's comfortable at first, but then her uncle sexually assaults her and she feels the need to leave. And he kind of cuts her off, refuses to help her, once she turns down his advances. So she's totally on her own. She leaves that home in Maine. She ends up in Connecticut by herself. And initially, she doesn't even have the money to keep going to school. She ends up as a waitress in like a diner. She's supporting herself, but obviously she's struggling. She doesn't have much money, and she's very isolated once she ends up in Connecticut. She doesn't have family there. She doesn't really have any connections there. So she is very much on her own. That's pretty obvious. We see that. And, it's obviously a difficult thing for her. And then we get that mention of something around her neck, something wrapping itself around her neck, nearly choking her. So we'll come back to that because that gets repeated, so we can talk about that particular concept or that object, whatever it is. It can be literal, it can be figurative, it's a pattern that we can detect, it's a device, it's a motif. We'll talk more about that, but we're obviously observing it as we read. Okay, and then she meets her future boyfriend. So I'm not going to get into a blow-by-blow plot summary, to take us all the way through, but we can obviously pick up from here, right? She meets the boyfriend. She's a little bit reluctant to date him at first, but he's kind of persistent. They end up in a relationship. But it is noteworthy that he knows a little bit about Africa. He's traveled. He's kind of more culturally sensitive, I guess, than a lot of other Americans that she's encountered. He actually knows a little bit about Nigeria, the different ethnic groups and languages that are found there. So he does seem a little bit different, a little more accepting. Although that gets complicated later. So they get into a relationship, and we could document that whole relationship. It has some ups and downs. So ultimately we could sum this story up pretty succinctly. She immigrates to America. She has to go through this process of adaptation, assimilation. She sort of is on her own, takes care of herself, gets into a relationship while she's in Connecticut, but she feels kind of conflicted about it. And then at the end of the story, she goes back home to Nigeria to see her family. And it's sort of unclear. It's a little bit uncertain as to whether or not she's going to continue to see this guy And it's a little bit unclear as to what she wants or kind of what the next step is going to be for her in her life. But we could summarize the story pretty quickly, pretty easily. It's pretty easy to follow. We understand what happens, and we can make some general points about theme without really going beneath the surface. Obviously, this story is very much about the immigration experience for this particular character. What it feels like to be an outsider, what it feels like to look different and to speak different, compared to a lot of the other people that you come into contact with, to be questioned about your heritage and your background, and to often be sort of lumped in with other groups, or to be sort of stereotyped or simplified, really, to be reduced to just a few specific qualities, not really feeling like you belong. But also, we see the process of her sort of learning about America. There's that great line early in the story, representing the expectations that she and her family sort of have for America. You thought everybody in America had a car and a gun, which isn't totally off base, but they have a lot of perceptions, a lot of preconceived notions about what America is, what the American dream is. And in many ways, our main character sort of learns that not all of those preconceived notions were correct. America's maybe a little bit different than how she imagined it in certain ways. In other ways, it might be more in line with some of their ideas and some of their sort of projections. But it's very much about immigrating, assimilating, that process of sort of having to, adopt new cultural traditions while maybe also trying to preserve your own. That's always very challenging, of course, for immigrants. So we kind of get that. And it's also kind of about her relationship with this guy, and is she going to stay with him? So on the surface, we can do a lot of work. We can pretty much reconstruct the plot. We can arrive at a pretty basic understanding of our protagonist and kind of what she's going through, how she feels. And we can make some general points about what the story is saying and really what the story is all about. Okay, great. So that's a surface level reading. And again, we start there. So when we're keeping our reading journals and we're jotting down some impressions and some ideas as we read these literary texts, it's not bad to, start on the surface, talk about things that happen in the plot, talk about some of the more obvious meanings that can be uncovered in your initial reading. But we don't want to stop there. Eventually, we want to think more about depth. We want to go beneath the surface. So again, sometimes I talk about this being similar to the difference between literal meaning and maybe figurative meaning. Sometimes if we're thinking about the literal, that is kind of surface level. It's the most obvious. But then figurative meaning, like figurative language, metaphors, similes, they often go beyond everyday reality. They go beyond what we can see and sort of perceive easily, right? They're capturing truths or meanings that are deeper, that are a little bit beyond the surface, a little bit beyond the literal. So that's kind of what we're doing now as we plunge beneath the surface and think about deeper meanings. Think about some of the deeper stuff at work in the text. So I would really start with the character being alone, solitude, isolation, a certain degree of alienation, particularly once she goes to Connecticut, right? She's sort of been cast off by her uncle, and that was a very, traumatic experience for her. So she's on her own, taking care of herself without much of a support system. Also, we can note that she's often treated like an object. So this is a bit of a deeper meaning that we need to probably explore if we're going to work with this story. She's often treated, somewhat politely by a lot of the people that she comes into contact with. But if we're paying close attention, which of course we need to do when we go beneath the surface, we notice that everybody tends to either want something from her or they sort of view her as like a curiosity, an exotic curiosity. In some cases, men want her for sex, obviously, but then other people seem just kind of intrigued by her because they probably don't know very many Africans or very many Nigerians. So people are kind of interested in her accent, in her background, in her skin color, in her hair, in some cases. And again, a lot of that attention is a little bit unwanted, right? She doesn't always really want people to touch her hair or ask her questions about her physical appearance, or ask her sort of ignorant questions about Africa, because many people just don't know very much about it. So again, this is why her boyfriend initially stands out in the midst of all of these other mostly white Americans that she encounters, because he does know a little bit more about the rest of the world, and he's not culturally insensitive. But maybe he is, as we learn later, just in more subtle, beneath the surface kinds of ways. So anyways, she's often treated as an object, which means that very few people really seem to get to know the true her. Her authentic self remains kind of a mystery to many. So again, that kind of ties back into her solitude and the fact that she's kind of isolated, cut off, and alienated from the main currents of American life, even as she meets people, even as she enters into a relationship with a guy and, meets his parents, and, they have a place they go to dinner often. She's starting to assimilate, but she remains kind of detached, because a lot of people don't know who she really is. They just think of her as exotic or different or interesting or attractive, and they're not really getting at the real her. Also, let's talk about that thing around your neck. So what is that? Obviously, she's speaking figuratively, I think. Maybe there is literally something around her neck, but I think she really means that phrase to signal something on a more figurative level. It's a metaphor, right? She feels suffocated. She feels trapped. Now, we have to figure out why. Why does she feel that way? I've maybe just mentioned a few reasons, but there's probably some others as well. So what is it? What is this feeling that she describes in this kind of abstract way on a couple of occasions? What is it? Is it the immigrant experience, just sort of in general, the difficulties of adjusting to a new culture, especially when you're all alone? She doesn't have people to help, people to lean on. So is that what it is? Is it being alone? Is it just the solitude that she's experiencing? Not being truly seen? Is that what it is? Is it something more? Is it something less? Is it assimilation? What is it that's making her feel that way? So we have to think about that. That's some of the deeper meaning that we have to try to grasp. And then we get to her boyfriend. Okay, so he's an interesting character because there's sort of a surface level appearance for him. We might initially have mostly positive impressions of him, but as the story progresses and we kind of get to eavesdrop on a couple of their conversations, we don't get a ton of dialogue in this text, but we get some, and some of their conversations are summarized for us, by the narrator. So we start to get a better impression of what this guy's all about. And he is sort of sensitive and nice in his way, sort of kind and generous in a way, but she starts to resent some certain things about him, and she starts to detect some problems with his outlook on the world and his attitude. And just to, simplify it, I think we could say that she begins to perceive him as really privileged, as really sheltered. His parents have money. He didn't have to go to college right away. He was able to travel and sort of do his own thing, obviously on his parents' dime, right? And she kind of resents that because she didn't have those kinds of opportunities. She's supporting herself, right? She came to America by herself. She's going to school by herself. doesn't really have anybody to do the things for her that his parents have done for him. But what really kind of pisses her off is that he seems kind of ungrateful towards his parents, right? He kind of resents them because they want him to, I don't know, go into a successful career and, do something with his life. And he just wants to sort of travel and be this sort of independent intellectual, I guess. So she begins to sort of resent him. And it's funny, she kind of likes his parents. You might think that she wouldn't like them, but they treat her with a little bit more respect. And she even points out that they don't treat her like an exotic curiosity. They don't treat her like some kind of, weird thing that they can question and wonder about. They treat her a little bit differently, and she appreciates that. But then her boyfriend kind of resents them, and she doesn't understand, his position or why he would feel that way. But also, she begins to resent his attitude about other countries, other parts of the world, so he's traveled, he's been to Africa, he's been through parts of Asia, and he talks about wanting to go back and, live amongst poor people, and he sort of romanticizes poor people, I think would be one way to characterize what he's doing. And she picks up on that. Like at one point he says the only real people in India are the poor people. And she's like, well, but that's just kind of a silly outlook, because she's like, does that mean that you're not a real American? Because you're not poor, you're rich. So if only poor people are authentic, citizens of their nation, what does that make you? Because you're obviously very privileged. And there's a great line, I thought I wrote it down here. Let me see. He talks about wanting to go to Nigeria with her. And we hear her views. You do not want him to go to Nigeria, to add it to the list of countries where he went to gawk at the lives of poor people who could never gawk back at his life. So again, and this gets talked about in other venues. This is like a certain kind of tourism that you do find sometimes with, I guess, people like him, right? He wants to go to these countries and experience something authentic. But she's picking up on what that sort of means for him. It's almost like voyeurism, like he wants to go and just sort of observe poor people, gawk at them, to use the language in the text. But it's very important to notice that she says those poor people could never come here to gawk at his life. So again, he's very privileged. He has this opportunity to travel and see other people, visit other places that, that's largely closed off to Acuna and people like her, people from the developing world, the very people that he's kind of romanticizing and saying, oh, I love these people. It's like, yeah, but then you get on a plane, come back to your nice home in Connecticut, borrow money, from your parents or whatever. And these poor people, they don't get to take a trip. They don't get to come over here as tourists and watch your life. So it seems very unequal to Acuna. It seems unfair. And she begins to perceive him as somewhat self-righteous, like he thinks he knows more about these cultures than he really does. And he thinks he knows what is authentic and what isn't. And she begins to resent him for those reasons. So again, it's a complicated relationship. So any real understanding of their relationship would require us to go beneath the surface. The surface is just kind of getting the basic event straight. He courts her. She doesn't really want to date him at first. Then she realizes she does. Again, that might just be a fear of loneliness. He's, maybe like a lifeline, a connection. She doesn't want to pass it up. There are some good moments in their relationship, but then things start to maybe fracture, and we have to track all of that, right? But then once we track kind of the development of the relationship, we have to start getting at the why and the how, right? Why does the relationship fracture? Why does she begin to resent him? So I've tried to lay out, some of those reasons. But we should also notice that, we hear about the thing around her neck twice in the actual text, I believe, unless I'm forgetting one. Of course, it's the title, and then we get it repeated twice. The first time, we get the sense that there is this thing around her neck, but then the next time we hear about it, we're told that the thing around her neck is like lessening, like she doesn't feel as much pressure. She doesn't feel as suffocated. And that time she's begun her relationship. So we can maybe speculate that at least at first, maybe the relationship helps her to feel less anxiety, less fear. So that figurative thing around her neck starts to diminish, but that might not last. That might just be in the early good stages of the relationship. And then as she learns more about him, maybe some of those positive things recede. So also, when we're thinking about their relationship, there's a very particular scene that I would recommend revisiting. So again, we might not really think about this when we're doing our surface level reading. But then when we go beneath the surface and do the depth, there's a particular moment that, again, says a lot about the boyfriend, but it also says a lot about society and how they are viewed as a couple. Because this also begins to bother Acuna. The way they're perceived, the way other people sort of think about them and conceive of them. So there's that time when they're at their sort of favorite restaurant, Chang's, a Chinese restaurant in Hartford. I think they're in Hartford, Connecticut. Or nearby. So they go there a lot. That's like their spot. So it's important to remember that. They go there a lot. They're having dinner one night. And of course, the boyfriend, who likes to be so cultured, he's talking to the Chinese waiter. And apparently, he's visited Shanghai before, so he knows a little bit about China. Again, you're noticing a trend here. He likes to talk about other cultures. He likes to sort of be the cultured, smart, sensitive American. Again, initially, we kind of like that maybe about him, or Acuna sort of likes that. And then later, it becomes something different. We start to maybe think about it differently. But anyway, he's just sort of, chatting with the waiter, and he mentions that he's been to Shanghai. And then the waiter says, oh, just kind of joking around, but he says, oh, do you have a girlfriend in Shanghai? And it's just kind of a joke. Okay, yeah, having fun. And then that's that. But it really hurts our narrator's feelings, because she perceives that the waiter doesn't consider, they're a couple, right? Clearly they're a couple. They go in there all the time together to have dinner. And she even mentions that they had kissed right before the waiter came back out. So it should be obvious to anybody paying even a little bit of attention that they are a couple, they are together. But yet the Chinese waiter doesn't really seem to think that they would be together. However, the waiter doesn't seem to think it far-fetched for the white boyfriend to have a Chinese girlfriend. So again, a lot is sort of happening there beneath the surface. And again, the boyfriend doesn't notice anything wrong. And when Acuna brings it up later, and sort of mentions, hey, it really hurt me when, you didn't say anything to the waiter. You didn't correct him to say, oh, no, she's my girlfriend. My girlfriend's sitting right here. I don't have one in Shanghai. I have one right here in Connecticut. She says it really kind of hurt my feelings that you didn't say anything. You just let him make that joke and just let it pass. And she says he has this, kind of blank look on his face. Like, he does apologize, but clearly he doesn't understand her position. He doesn't understand why that upset her. And how could he? He never has to deal with the kind of judgment and the kind of intolerance, that she deals with. So for him, it's just all a joke. Who cares? Just having dinner, talking to the waiter. But for her, it means something. It means something on multiple levels. It means something that he doesn't notice the problem, he doesn't care, but also it speaks to society's perception. Again, it's hard for a lot of Americans to imagine that a white American guy would date a Nigerian woman, and that bothers her for obvious reasons. And that episode really sort of represents a larger trend that emerges in their relationship. So that's a really important scene. On our surface level reading, again, we might not really acknowledge it or notice it very much, but when we're doing our depth reading, that's when we can dig into specific scenes and say, oh yeah, this is an important moment because it's illustrating really important ideas that are a big part of the overall theme. So those are just some of the things we could dig into more on our depth round. So we have that surface level, and that's our first reading. And then we might go back through and read the text again, or at least reread some passages, reread a couple of specific scenes, start thinking about some of the important literary elements a little bit more, push beneath the surface, and we can arrive at some of this stuff I've been talking about under depth. And any one of those things could be potentially explored in an analysis paper. Now, even some of the surface level stuff could show up in a paper, but really it would just help you to set the stage and kind of give us a little plot recap to set up your analysis. So the depth is going to be more valuable when it comes to actually generating original points, because nothing on the surface is really going to result in a ton of original analysis. Right? The surface is just the basic stuff, the obvious stuff. We start there and then we go beyond it. So that's our first major strategy. And I want us to kind of just do that with everything that we read. Start with that surface level reading, make sure we understand everything. And sometimes we have to work a little bit to understand. Not all of these literary texts are super easy to understand. So there is work to be done on the surface level, on the literal level, but then we go back through and we do more of an in-depth reading, and that's always important. Okay, so let's move on to our second strategy for today, patterns. Another pretty easy one to implement because it's not hard to notice patterns in the works of literature that we read. But again, identifying them is great. That's what you start with. You identify patterns, anything that you notice. Repetition is often one of the most recognizable patterns that we'll see in fiction and poetry. So you start by identifying the patterns, and then you need to do something with them. So let's get a definition down for patterns. You can just write down that here we are identifying an image or a word choice or really any other kind of repeating pattern that shows up in a literary text. So again, we start by identifying it, and then we can come up with some original ideas about it. So again, this can be almost anything. I mentioned a couple of examples in the definition. So some of the patterns you can be finding might be recurring images. And I don't mean like a visual image, I'm talking about imagery, which we should be familiar with is one of our big literary elements that shows up in fiction and it shows up in poetry. Imagery is just particular words, phrases, sentences that paint a picture in our minds. Now, technically, imagery can utilize any of our five senses, but obviously the sense that we use the most, probably, and we use it the most when we read, is our sense of sight. We're imagining what things look like. So often imagery will appear in really good, vivid descriptions. Like if places are being described, that's often a good example of imagery. Or if certain objects or animals or even people are being described, that can be perceived as an example of imagery. So sometimes that imagery will get repeated, a certain description, a certain description of an appearance will get repeated throughout a text. We can notice that. Also, individual words can be repeated. Also, phrases or sentences can be repeated. So we can always notice those instances. I mentioned just any repeating pattern. Any repeating pattern that you notice in the text. And that could be objects, that could be concepts. Again, these could be specific like verbal things like words or phrases that keep on turning up. But sometimes the patterns might be a little bit more abstract. they might be a little bit more about concepts or ideas that keep showing up. Sometimes there'll be examples of figurative language that keep on showing up. Metaphors, a particular metaphor might keep on showing up in the text. So you should notice that. Do something with that. In other cases, we can talk about what are called tropes. And tropes typically just refer to recurring features, things that show up a lot in a particular text. And in some cases, we can talk about tropes that are common just like in an entire genre, really. Common tropes in romantic comedies, common tropes in horror movies. But these are just things that show up, features, elements that often show up in those kinds of texts. So that could be any number of things. Again, often they might be like literal objects in the text, but then in other cases that might be an idea. It might be a description. It might be a certain way of feeling that keeps reappearing. But anytime something gets repeated in a text, you definitely want to notice. Because if it's repeated, that means it matters. That means it's important and you want to do something with it. So let's just think about some examples of a few patterns that we can find in this short story. So obviously, we'll start with the title because we've already talked about it, the thing around your neck. How do we want to classify that? Is that a figure of speech? Again, is that just a metaphor that Adichie is using? It's not literally something around her neck, but it's just something that makes her feel trapped. It makes her feel suffocated. Is that really what it is? Is it just an idea? Is it a metaphor? That's fine. But, I guess we could perceive it as maybe literal. Maybe it's a real thing, but most likely it's a figurative thing. Right? So again, it exists on a level that maybe isn't entirely surface level or literal. It has this deeper meaning. It kind of goes beyond everyday reality. It's really giving us insight into how she feels and maybe how she thinks. So it's really granting us, this metaphor is granting us a lot of interiority. That's a term I'll use sometimes. That means we're just getting access to the interior life of a character. And we don't always get that as a reader. It's important to notice that often we have somewhat limited access to our characters. And in this story, the only character that we ever get access to, their feelings, their thoughts, it's just our protagonist, right? We don't know really what most of the other characters are kind of what they have going on in their interior lives. But usually our protagonist, particularly if we have a first-person narrator, we will get access to their interior lives. But sometimes that can be lacking. And when we get that access, we need to pay attention to what we are learning about the character's thoughts, feelings, their emotional state. So, yeah, the thing around your neck, it appears multiple times. It gets repeated. It's obviously the title, so that tells us that it's important. We got to figure out what it is and what it means. And has she broken free of it by the end of the story? Is she still going to feel that way by the end of the story? What do we think? Is she embarking on a new life that might give her relief from that feeling? Or is she going to keep experiencing it? Okay, another pattern that we can definitely do something with is you. We all notice this when we read the story. This is second person narration, which is weird a little bit. Like we don't see second person nearly as much as we see first person and third person. So we have to really interrogate why Adichie is using this particular narrative point of view. It's a lot less common than first person and third person. So why? She made a very conscious choice. Why does she use it? And think about the effect that it has on readers. A lot of people notice this. When you keep reading, you did this, you did that, you felt this way, it really does implicate the reader, right? Directly, not just implicate, it makes you feel like you're the one doing all of these things. But that's not the case, right? Actually, this is the narrator's own experiences being rendered to us, but she's doing it as if the reader did the stuff that she did. So this is a very direct way of addressing readers and kind of bringing readers into the action, making us feel like we are in the role of the main character, but we're not. We're learning about the main character, but just by using that second person pronoun, there's this sense that we are active, we are involved, we are doing the stuff and feeling the stuff that's being described. So just think more about that. How does that make you feel as a reader? Does that sort of connect you more to the protagonist? Does it create a weird sort of almost contradictory sense of like distance? What does it do? How does it make you perceive the main character? And maybe how does it make you think about your own relationship to the main character? Like, do you share any commonalities with the main character? Does the second person narration highlight the differences between many readers and the narrator? Like, there's a lot you can do. You can think about intended audience. You can think about the effects on readers. There's a lot there. Because clearly Adichie chose to do this for a very particular reason. So you gotta think about point of view. And that that's something that you're gonna notice on your surface level reading. You're going to notice the unusual point of view. But on the surface level, you might just observe it. Yeah, that's weird. I don't read a lot of stories like that. But then as you move on, again, start thinking about the how and the why. Why is the author doing this? And how does it make me feel? How does it influence or affect my overall reading experience? Okay. Another word that just gets repeated a lot, if we're just thinking about word choice, is he. Because whenever the boyfriend is doing something, a lot of those sentences begin with he. So we do get a lot of the third person pronoun as well. And again, we don't get names very much in this text. We don't refer to people typically by their names. Like, we don't know her uncle's name. We don't really hear people call her by her name. We might learn, now I'm not remembering if we learned the boyfriend's name at a certain point or not, but we certainly don't hear it very much. So what is that all about? Why is Adichie relying so much on pronouns, whether it be you or he, versus names? Again, names might create a more intimate, familiar setting, whereas pronouns might make us feel a little more distant and detached. Maybe not. That's just a possibility. That's how some people feel. But how do you feel reading all of these pronouns and not really hearing a lot of names? What kind of effect does that have? Because that could be important. That could be something that you explore. Also, we can get more concrete. We're getting a little abstract with all the pronoun usage, but what about Chang's? What about the Chinese restaurant? That kind of functions as a recurring feature, right? They go to that restaurant multiple times. There are multiple moments in the story that kind of take place there. And there's that important scene that I was talking about earlier with our in-depth reading, where a very important truth is revealed over the course of that dinner, as the boyfriend talks to the waiter about his girlfriend in Shanghai, So Chang's seems important. That's their place. So that matters, at least within the context of their relationship. Okay, so that's something we could explore more. Going back to word choice, I've just written down a whole bunch of potential patterns. Again, you wouldn't have to explore all of these. These are just some options. But how about just the word Africa and the word America? Because we hear them a lot too. We see those words a lot. And obviously, they represent different things. They mean different things. They symbolize different things. So symbolism is always another literary element that we can consider. So again, that's just more word choice that we can think about. But there are also figures of speech. There are physical locations that we can explore. There's a sort of running feature of difference, cultural difference. It gets highlighted throughout the text. So we might perceive that as a trope with any story that features immigrants and the immigrant experience, right? That's a feature that we're often going to find. We're going to learn about sort of a clash of culture, transitioning from one culture to another, learning how to adapt your old culture to a new one. Like that always shows up, right? That's just always an idea that's at work, at least on some level, with any story about the immigrant experience. So that's something we can think about. That's an idea, right? That's sort of a recurring feature that we can locate throughout the text. So, that's something we could play around with. Also, an object that could function as a pretty important recurring feature would be the extra virgin olive oil, because that gets mentioned multiple times. That is the main character's favorite thing in America. But also, when she's first getting together with her boyfriend, I think it's his eyes. His eyes, or something about his complexion. And again, he's very fair skinned. He's a white guy with blonde hair and light colored eyes. So there's something about his physical appearance that reminds her of extra virgin olive oil. And that object gets repeated. It gets mentioned multiple times, and it has importance that goes beyond the literal. So like on the literal level, yeah, she just likes it, right? I mean, it is important that we know that. That's one of her favorite things about America. So, okay, fine. That's easy to understand. She likes the taste of it. She likes to cook with it. Okay, fine. But we can only get so far with that. The more significant meaning of that olive oil is the fact that it's somehow connected to the boyfriend, right? There's something about him that connects to this one thing that she really loves in America. So it's about his appearance, but it might be about more than that too. It's about what he represents, what he symbolizes, at least at first. He might present some kind of possibility of safety, comfort, acceptance. And the olive oil is kind of tied up with all of that. So that's a pattern that we could detect. So any one of those could give you a lot of material to work with, in a potential analysis. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then our final strategy for today is opposites. So this is a pretty easy one. I'll try to keep it brief because I want to end this lecture soon. I'll try to always keep these around 45 minutes to 50 minutes if I can. This one's already gone a little beyond that. But another common strategy we can use is opposites, identifying opposites or potential contradictions in a text. And then we draw conclusions about what those opposites or contradictions really mean. So in this text, there's obviously, we can consider, America and Africa to sort of be opposites in some ways. They represent different things. They are different in a lot of obvious ways. Maybe Akuna and her boyfriend also kind of opposites, not just because of their race, not just because of their cultures, but also because of social class. So I would argue that social class is an important sort of through line. It's an important motif that kind of runs through the text. I'll define the words trope and motif for us. Sometimes I kind of use those terms interchangeably. They kind of mean different things. I'll define those in the week 2 module because these are all sort of important vocabulary terms for us. But social class is kind of important here too, right? Because it puts up barriers between the two of them. They come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, and that matters. She comes to notice that class matters a lot in America. She learns about rich people. She learns about poor people in America. And again, we can go back to some of those perceptions of America that she has when she first travels here. So we can think about the contradictions between maybe the way people outside of America imagine America, so some of their ideas, some of their sort of idealistic, in some cases, ideas about it versus the reality. So the reality doesn't always match up with the image or the promise that sometimes sort of spread to these people in the developing world who want to come here for a better life. So again, think about the American dream. That's something that not just Americans know and think about. That's been exported. Everybody kind of knows what the American dream is. But does her experience necessarily line up with that sort of idealized version of what America is and what America can be? Maybe you think it does in some ways. I mean, there are opportunities in America. She is able to advance herself and work hard and get certain things. And it's not all bad, right? But her experiences just might not line up with those preconceived notions. Again, her boyfriend is another sort of, we can explore opposites or contradictions within him. Initially, he seems culturally sensitive, kind, nice, great. But is he actually kind of the opposite? Is he actually sort of condescending and arrogant about his knowledge and about non-American, non-white people? Again, we might arrive at that conclusion. It kind of seems like Acuna does. She kind of goes from thinking, oh, he's different from most Americans, to then maybe changing her mind. But she does say at one point, Americans who don't care about Africa or at all, and Americans who care about it a lot, are often obnoxious in the same way. They're sort of sharing a certain kind of arrogance, whether they know a lot or not, because there's still kind of that underlying assumption that they know more than the Africans. They might even know more, or they might just be better. If they don't know more, they're just superior in some way. And she starts to perceive that in her boyfriend. We might not agree with her reading of him. We might have a more generous perception of him, but certainly she comes to question her original sort of judgment of him. So we can view that character and the way the character is developed as another opportunity to look at possible opposites, possible contradictions. So again, contradictions can sometimes just be kind of what we expect as a reader versus what we actually see. Or it can be, what a character appears to be versus what they really are. It could be what a character expects versus what they really get. All of those could be potential contradictions. So sometimes we might think the contradictions are intentionally built into the text. In other cases, we might think that they're not necessarily supposed to be there, but they are there, and we're discovering them as readers. But these are just other things that you can always pursue in an analysis. All right, so my final thought for today is just another reminder to try to keep a reading journal. As you are reading our weekly literary selections, it's important to record your impressions, your thoughts, your questions, your feelings. And like I was saying last week, we're sort of getting comfortable with this progression from our initial surface level emotional response to a text. And that's what the reading journal can be for, and that's also what the discussion board can sort of be for. Like, just record that emotional response. I liked it. I didn't like it. It made me feel this way. It made me feel that way. That's a good start. But another thing you can be doing, in your reading journals as you're recording some of those initial responses, you can also do a little bit of annotating. And I want to talk about this. I bring this up in all my English classes, going all the way back to 101, because annotating is really important, especially as we get to the higher levels and we're doing more complex we're handling more complex text. So to annotate, as most of you probably know, it just means to take notes while you read. And traditionally, we would do this in the margins of a book. And I've actually posted just an image of one of my books from school that I annotated, just to give you an example of the kinds of notes that people tend to take. And many of you might already do this. You know, annotations can be very informal. Sometimes you're asking questions, but you're identifying things, right? You can identify important passages, important metaphors, important things that we're learning about characters, setting, whatever. There's really no hard and fast rules. You're just jotting down ideas, questions. You might define some words or write down little brief explanations for yourself so you can better understand the text. So I really encourage you guys to do that, especially if you're working with a hard copy of our book and you're reading this stuff in the book. Mark up those pages. I know a lot of you intend to sell your book back and you want to maximize the resale value. You don't want to mark up the pages. I get that, and if that's your position, I would just say, fine, you can annotate on a separate sheet of paper. That's very possible, and in fact, you can do it in your reading journal entries. If you don't actually want to mark up the book, a lot of the notes that would traditionally be in the margins can just be on a separate sheet of paper or in a Word doc, whatever you want. But it's just good to write some of that stuff down. You're creating a written record that you'll be able to use later if you're going to write about that text, if you're going to actually analyze that text. So, you know, the stuff that you would have underlined, the stuff that you would have jotted down in the margins, you can recreate all of that on a separate sheet of paper. And that might be part of what you're doing in your reading journal entries. You can just include some annotations, some notes. They don't have to be in complete sentences. They don't have to be in complete paragraphs. And then you can also maybe jot down just your feelings, your thoughts, and those can be incomplete sentences, of course, and that could maybe be how a lot of your journal entries work. But I would just encourage you guys to follow all these steps. Annotate as you read, then jot down a brief reading journal entry, and then you'll be ready to do your discussion post. And then after the discussion post, you'll be ready to do real analysis if the occasion ever comes along. Because, of course, we're not going to analyze everything that we read, but we are analyzing some of it. So you'll always be prepared. Okay, that's it for this week. We'll come back next week and tackle a few new strategies, and we're also reading some poetry in week 2. So I'll be talking about those poems next week as we tackle our new strategies. Email me if you have any questions or concerns. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.